Wee woo, wee woo, wee woo, it's the PTR police. Today we have a new build in the PTR with some spec and class tuning. So we have some tiny changes, but positive overall. We have some medium-sized changes, which were nerfs, but expected. And then we have the big ones. We have the big positive changes and the big negative changes. So let's start in order with the tiny one, which is the one to Guardian Druid. This one is positive overall. It starts in a quite irrelevant way because Untamed Savagery is what gets buffed, but Untamed Savagery is not a talent being taken by Guardian. So Blizzard is trying, like they did before multiple times, to buff a talent which is not currently being played in the hopes that it will be played somewhat soon. Spoiler alert, no, it will not be played. It's still far too to the left for Guardian to use it. Now, what's the positive change for Guardian is that Thorns of Iron has been moved to row 6 instead of row 9. So it's no longer in the last bracket of talents. It's no longer in those last very important points you have to very carefully think about where to spend on. Now, being in the middle row of talents, it's a much more manageable talent to pick up, and it's very good passive damage. It's a very good passive AoE damage, particularly in Mythic Plus. Guardian being a tank without really that good of an AoE damage in Mythic Plus as well, this will help the overall damage of Guardian Druid. Then we have a set of changes which I won't bore you too much with because they are changes to augmentation. And of course you don't know a fucking thing about augmentation, so since everything I'm about to say about augmentation will enter one of your ears and exit the other one immediately, let's be short about augmentation. The TLDR is that it gets nerfed. The first iteration of the spec was quite OP for its effect, so a whole bunch of the effects are getting nerfed. Breath of Eons, the big cooldown, is now 30 seconds longer in cooldown from 1.5 to 2 minutes. The follow-up talent, also very powerful, Chrono Ward, now has the Absorb Shield caused by the ability capped at 30% of the Evoker's max HP, also very expected change. And then the nerf to their core mechanic. The whole core of Augmentation Evoker is to use Ebon Might to buff 4 allies to their primary stat. Unfortunately, the first iteration of augmentation had the skill ceiling of this spec to be very low, and the skill floor also to be very high. That's because it was quite simple, quite easy to be able to keep this Ebon Might buff up, basically all the times. So Blizzard is trying to make it a little bit harder to raise the skill ceiling of the spec, to try to differentiate between the bad Augmentation Evokers and the good Augmentation Evokers that can extend the duration of this buff properly. The first change is that Sands of Time now causes your Empower spells to extend Ebon Might by 2 seconds instead of 3 seconds. Those are the highlights for now to the changes of augmentation. We won't go any more in depth to the spec. We are still too far away from the release of 10.1.5 to judge in detail about the changes. Instead, we can already judge in detail the changes of Devastation. Devastation gets its mastery nerfed by 20%, but all of their damage is increased by 6.5%. In case you're not aware, the mastery of Devastation makes them do more damage the more health the enemy has. Basically, burst damage on pull is super strong for Devastation. On pull, every Mythic Plus pack is super powerful. On pull of a raid boss, as well as whenever a new mob spawns in a raid boss, the Evoker has a very good advantage to damaging that mob because of their mastery. Blizzard doesn't want their burst damage to be so high to high HP targets, so they are nerfing their mastery by 20% but buffing their overall damage. This is basically a neutral change, essentially. It's a nerf the more mastery you have, and it's a slight buff the less mastery you have. Because, of course, you lose less value if you have less mastery, since your mastery has been nerfed by 20%, and then you gain the value because all of your spells have been increased by 6.5% more damage. So it won't really net out to be that much of a drastic change in terms of overall damage, but it will definitely make the burst of Devastation weaker overall. Talking about the major massive changes, the first in line is Mage, Fire, and Positive. So Fire is one of the specs which is receiving a ret Paladin-like size of rework in 10.1.5. Now, many of the changes, if not most of the changes in here, are going to be positive. So the main logic of Blizzard is to turn Ignite into a single target or 2 to 3 targets type of ability, and then move Flame Strike back to being a used spell for big AoE pulls. They are nerfing things like, for example, your Mastery now automatically spreading Ignite with Fire Blast to just 3 targets instead of 4. The buff given by Master of Flame while you are in Combustion, instead of spreading Ignite to 4 additional targets, is now just 2 additional targets. More changes once again to solidify the fact that they want Ignite to be a fewer target playstyle. Now you have Intensifying Flames. While Ignite is on 3 or fewer enemies, it deals 15% more damage, for example. Ignite simply spreads less often. In return, Flame Strike is now a baseline spell, no longer costs a talent point. Flame Strike takes half a second less to cast and will have more supporting AoE talents to do more damage. This is the main change in terms of damage profile for Fire. Now Ignite is no longer, or they are trying to make Ignite no longer a massive AoE type of playstyle, but a more reduced target count of playstyle to try to force Fire Mages to take Flame Strike and put it back into their action bars, which they haven't done in a while. The other super positive change for Fire, which many players have been welcoming with a roaring success, is the removal of Pyroclasm. Now, Pyroclasm has been cooked into Sun King's Blessing, and the duration of Sun King's Blessing, so the time you have to hard cast a Pyroblast and proc your mini combustion, goes from 15 to 30 seconds. So you have a much larger window for you to not lose this buff. Imagine the triggering when, for example, you have to move from one trash pack to the next, one trash pack to the boss, or when the boss in the raid is changing phases, he's having an intermission, and you can lose that buff. That's very triggering. Now the buff lasts for 30 seconds and makes it much more easy not to lose this buff. Not to mention, the removal of Pyroclasm and cooking it into Sun King's Blessing removes the need for mages to play with the hard-casted Pyroblast style. Now the hard-cast Pyroblast will only go back to being used to activate Sun King's Blessing. So only once in a while to proc your combustion, and that's it. So the ideas are clear for Fire. They want single target and 2 to 3 targets damage to be done with Ignite and single target spells, and then they want the damage in big AoE pools to be done with Flame Strike. They also have supporting buffs to other AoE spells long forgotten by Fire Mages, like for example Living Bomb, now doing more damage and having a chance to having a reduced cooldown, as well as multiple buffs to Meteor, multiple buffs to the damage of Meteor, to the cooldown reduction of Meteor. So they are trying to give back to Fire Mage some of the long unused AoE spells for the spec, rather than once again defaulting to just damaging everything with Ignite, like Fire has been doing for quite a while now. Finishing the whole list of changes with even more positive quality of life additions of, for example, making finally a sensible From the Ashes talent. Before, this talent was very contradictory because it wanted you to hold on, it wanted you to not cast Phoenix Flames if you wanted to get multiple stacks of Mastery. It is dumb design, something that rewards you from not clicking an ability. So instead now this has been reverted. Now the Mastery stacking buff of From the Ashes will happen if you have Phoenix Flames on cooldown. So if you have used charges of Phoenix Flames, you are getting your Mastery buff. So this now makes much more sense and makes the playstyle much better and flow much better for Fire Mage. So overall, quite the list of positive changes happening to Fire. This is on top of the already announced changes to the 10.1.5 patch, like for example things like Rune of Power being removed, further making the spec less clunky to play, etc, etc. But these in particular were the changes in this last build of the PTR. We then have quite a lot of changes to Holy Paladin, which is also another one of the specs planned to have a rework in 10.1.5, but this time they are much fewer in size because they are mostly focused around mana management. One of the bigger of the changes is that now Word of Glory and Light of Dawn, which are your spenders that cost holy power, now actually also cost base mana. In return, you have plenty of other ways to get your mana back. For example, Crusader Strike and Holy Shock now cost less mana, Flash of Light and Holy Light, as if you ever even use them, also cost less mana. You have a talent to give you 5% of your mana back whenever you use Lay on Hands. You also have a talent, Reclamation, to make your Holy Shock and Crusader Strike refund back up to 15% of their mana when you use them. So most of the changes are still centered around trying to work out how much mana Holy Paladin will spend. So we still don't know exactly the full result of these changes, just exactly how mana intensive will the rotation of Holy Paladin be. So for now, we can keep this on hold before we see more changes and how it actually plays out in actual content. However, the biggest set of changes, but this time in the negative, goes for Demonology Warlock. So, since the posting of this, the dev in charge of Demo is now at large. He is being currently hunted and pursued by the local law enforcement patrols, and currently the reward for his capture, dead or alive, is at $17 million. This is the appropriate reward given the damages planned on being done to Demo in 10.1.5. This dev said that these changes were planned to fix the peaks and valleys of the damage profile of Demo. To give you the actual picture of these peaks and valleys, he meant this, okay? He meant the difference in damage when Demo has the cooldowns and then when Demo doesn't have the cooldown. As you can see here, the cycle of Demo is use every single cooldown plus trinket plus power infusion on pull, and then 1.5 minutes later use only a handful of the cooldowns that are back, and then 1.5 minutes later, so 3 minutes into the fight, use all of those cooldowns again, rinse and repeat. That's the cycle of the damage of Demo. Now that might even make sense, it might even be good to change that damage profile. Unfortunately, what followed are a list of changes that make no sense based on what was explained at the start. The initial decision was to remove several talents, many of which were going to make the gameplay a little bit more clunky because they were lowering the resource generation of your soul shards as well as of your demonic core stacks, and more importantly also removing Ripped Through the Portal, which is the talent that gives you your third Dreadstalker, which is not only just more AoE damage, almost passive AoE damage, but also one more demonic core being generated by the third Dreadstalker expiring. On top of this, many of the buffs that were given to Demo made no sense because you had your Shadow Bolt damage being buffed, your Demon Bolt damage being buffed, your Hand of Gul'dan damage or your Hand of Gul'dan critical strike chance being buffed, even though you are supposed to be a master demonologist summoning pets, you get these talents giving you more spell damage. Also, what was worse is that the new talents taking place that were buffing your pets were also extremely uninspired. Things like your Felguard's Legion Strike damage is increased by 10%, your Felguard's Fellstorm damage is increased by 5%, your Felguard's damaging critical strikes deal 10 to 20% more damage. You know, these look like talents from vanilla. Very, very simple, straightforward percentage increases, not really much else being changed about your spec. So all in all, despite the initial explanation from the dev about wanting to change a little bit the damage profile of Demo, what actually came and what actually followed weren't actually changes that were going to modify this situation. Especially because as long as Demo will have these talents, these stars to align every couple of minutes or every 3 minutes, that's what their profile for damage will look like, just very, very heavy around cooldowns. Now, luckily, the feedback of demo locks in the last couple of days have been brutal enough to change the mind of the dev about the changes for demo. So now we have changes to the initial planned changes for demo. Yes, we still have some of the originally planned talents being removed, still being removed. Rip through the portal, so your third Dreadstalker is still going away. Demonic Meteor and Fell Might are still going away, but Shadow's Bite makes it back into your talents, as well as Demonic Knowledge make it back into your talents. Also, more good news for demo, because Fell Covenant, a terrible talent doing exactly what demo locks didn't want, which was more spell damage to your spells, which is not how you want to play demo, has been removed, as well as Shadow Flame Acolyte, yet another boring spell damage talent to your spells, which you didn't care about as demo. Also, you have some compensation changes, which is that Implosion now deals 15% more damage, and Dreadstalker damage is also increased by 15%, compensating for the fact that now you lose your third Dreadstalker from losing the talent. So we do have not nearly as bad of a situation as before. The dev explains that still Rip Through the Portal was too strong to keep in, especially because it was going to beat all the other alternatives available because it was too powerful, so might as well remove it, buff the base damage of Dreadstalkers in the hopes of opening up more options. And lastly, the point about the demonic core generation, admitting that removing Demonic Knowledge plus Demonic Meteor plus Ripped Through the Portal was perhaps too much of a push in the direction of the generation, of course, as well as the mobility, because a lot of those changes would have ended up meaning fewer instant cast demon bolts, meaning you now have to hard cast your spells and be much less mobile. So they are trying to find a balanced situation where you're not just casting your generator as the insta cast demon bolt from your demonic core stacks, but at the same time you're also not hard casting too many of those or too many shadow bolts either. That has been the idea with this change to the original planned changes to demo, and not nearly as bad as the initial reception to the changes of demo. So with this, these are all the changes for today. We started on a decently nice note with Guardian, we went even better with Fire Mage. It was still okay to see the changes of Holy Paladin, and then a little bit worried about the changes to demo. Now not nearly as bad with this last minute hotfix change to the planned changes coming to 10.1.5. So with this finally done with on this Saturday, it's time to leave each other. We are starting, of course, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, and as usual you have plenty of other ways to support for free. You can like and comment down below on this video, you can subscribe to the channel itself, as well as following me over on Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, once again, congratulations to all of the geniuses mowing their lawns at 9 in the morning.